Washington, D.C., 1942. Less than a year after Pearl Harbor, the Allies are losing the war. In the dark days of 1942, the Axis tide seemed unstoppable. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of Egypt, Allied forces were in retreat. In Washington, a promise had been made. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had assured Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin that America and Britain would open a second front in Europe before the year 1942 was out, a desperate measure to relieve the immense pressure on the beleaguered Red Army. But how and where remained a matter of bitter and divisive debate. The American High Command, led by the formidable Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, saw only one path to victory: a direct, overwhelming assault on the heart of Nazi power. Their strategy, Germany first, centered on a massive buildup of men and materiel in the United Kingdom, codenamed Operation Bolero, in preparation for a full-scale invasion of France in 1943, Operation Roundup. If Russia seemed on the verge of collapse, a smaller emergency landing could even be attempted in 1942, a risky gambit called Operation Sledgehammer. This was a strategy born of American industrial confidence, a belief in winning the war with a single decisive blow. But America's British allies were horrified. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his chief strategist, General Sir Alan Brooke, were haunted by the ghosts of the past. The catastrophic losses of World War I and the fresh humiliation of the disastrous raid on Dieppe had taught them the brutal cost of premature assaults on fortified coastlines. They argued for a peripheral strategy, a patient, indirect approach to close the ring around Germany by attacking its weaker points, the soft underbelly of Axis-controlled Europe. French North Africa. For General Marshall and his naval counterpart, Admiral Ernest King, the British plan was heresy. They saw the North African invasion, then codenamed Gymnast, as a dangerous diversion. It would consume precious shipping, landing craft, and troops, making the decisive cross-channel attack in 1943 impossible. It was, in their view, a strategically irrelevant sideshow that would mire the Allies in the Mediterranean and delay victory. This fundamental disagreement was more than a simple dispute over tactics. It was a collision of national military philosophies. The British caution was forged in the bloody attrition of the Somme and the recent disaster at Dunkirk. The American approach reflected a nation confident in its industrial might, but still untested against the seasoned German Wehrmacht. The military debate reached an impasse. The decision fell to one man, President Roosevelt, and he was looking at a different map. On his map, the pressure from Stalin was a strategic reality that could not be ignored. The promise of a second front had to be kept, and with Sledgehammer deemed impossible, North Africa was the only option left on the table. At home, the political clock was ticking. 1942 was a congressional election year. The American people, reeling from Pearl Harbor, needed to see their sons in the fight against Germany. Morale demanded action. Roosevelt was adamant. U.S. troops had to engage the Germans somewhere before the end of the year. In a move that demonstrated a masterful grasp of grand strategy, Roosevelt subordinated military doctrine to political necessity. He understood that maintaining the Grand Alliance with the Soviets and sustaining the will of the American people were objectives as vital as any military victory. In late July 1942, he overruled his top generals. In one of only 2 direct orders he gave to his military commanders during the entire war, he decreed that the North African invasion, now codenamed Operation Torch, was to have precedence over all other operations and was to take place at the earliest possible date. The debate was over. The torch was to be lit. The Great Armada, Gibraltar, November 1942. The largest amphibious force in history prepares to strike. The man chosen to lead this immense and risky enterprise was a relatively unknown staff officer, Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower. From a dank, airless command post carved deep inside the Rock of Gibraltar, he would command the largest amphibious invasion the world had yet seen. Operation Torch would be his crucible, a test not only of his military planning but of his diplomatic skill in holding together a complex and sometimes fractious Anglo-American coalition. North Africa was controlled by the pro-German Vichy regime, and no one knew how its 125,000 troops would react. To solve this political problem, the Allies deployed a weapon as critical as any battleship: propaganda. The operation was meticulously branded as an American endeavor. Churchill readily agreed, knowing the Vichy French harbored a deep bitterness toward the British since the Royal Navy's attack on their fleet at Mers el-Kébir in 1940. The hope was that the historic friendship between America and France would persuade the Vichy forces to lay down their arms. Thousands of leaflets were printed in French and Arabic, carrying a personal message from President Roosevelt. "We come to you to liberate you from your conquerors," it read. "We come to you solely to defeat your enemies. We wish you no harm. We will leave as soon as the menace of Germany and Italy is dissipated." This was a sophisticated form of information warfare, central to the operational plan. The first shots of Operation Torch were to be rhetorical, aimed at winning the battle before the first soldier hit the beach by collapsing the enemy's will to fight. The logistical scale of Torch was staggering. 3 separate armadas, a combined fleet of over 650 warships and transports carrying 107,000 troops, set sail in secret. The most audacious component was the Western Task Force. Commanded by the fiery Major General George S. Patton, it sailed directly from Hampton Roads, Virginia. A 4,000-mile journey across the storm-tossed, U-boat-infested North Atlantic with 35,000 men and 250 tanks. Never before had an invasion force been projected across an entire ocean to conduct a contested landing. The paramount need for secrecy was a race against time and German intelligence. That 3 separate fleets could converge simultaneously and undetected off the coast of North Africa was a near miraculous feat of planning and coordination. But it was also a profound strategic statement. The success of this crossing signaled to the world a new era in the projection of American military power. It proved that the United States could now deliver its might anywhere on the globe, a foundational moment in its rise as a global superpower. November 8, 1942. 0400 hours. In the pre-dawn blackness of November 8th, the American soldiers of the Western Task Force approached the coast of Africa. For most, it was their first time in combat. They were about to receive a brutal education in the realities of amphibious warfare. The pre-war American doctrine for such operations was vague and untested. It was about to collide with the unforgiving friction of war. 8 hour at Fadala, intermingled and confused. The main landing by the 3rd Infantry Division at Fadala descended into chaos almost immediately. The decision not to bombard the coast, made in the vain hope the French would not resist, proved a costly mistake. Unexpectedly high surf caught the landing craft, smashing them against rocks and sandbars. Of the 347 boats used, nearly half were wrecked by the waves, not by enemy fire. The assault waves disintegrated. Troops were scattered onto the wrong beaches, units became hopelessly intermingled, and vital equipment was lost to the sea. Despite the confusion, the sheer shock of the landing achieved tactical surprise, and the town of Fadala itself was quickly secured. But as the sun rose, the battle began in earnest. French shore batteries on Cape Fadala roared to life, their shells raining down on the beaches and the vulnerable transport ships offshore. A desperate fight to silence the guns ensued, a bloody initiation for the green American troops. The battle for Port Lyautey, a short, sharp, murderous battle. Further north, elements of the 9th Infantry Division faced an even tougher fight at Port Lyautey. Their objective was a critical all-weather airfield, but it was defended by the ancient mud-walled Kasbah, a fortress that dominated the landscape. For 2 days, determined French defenders inside the Kasbah repulsed every American attack in what one participant called a short, sharp, murderous battle. The confusion of the invasion was tragically embodied in the fate of Colonel Demas Craw. He and another officer went ashore under a flag of truce, carrying a letter from General Eisenhower urging the French commander to join the Allies. As they approached the French lines, a nervous machine gunner opened fire, killing Colonel Craw instantly. It was a stark symbol of the miscalculation at the heart of the operation. The American hope for a peaceful reception was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of their opponent. The Vichy French were not fighting for Hitler. They were fighting under orders to defend French soil from any invader, a matter of military honor and duty that Allied secrecy had made tragically unavoidable. As the chaos unfolded on the beaches, the largest surface naval battle of the war in the Atlantic erupted off Casablanca. The brand-new American battleship USS Massachusetts and its screening cruisers found themselves in a thunderous duel with French shore batteries and the powerful, half-finished battleship Jean Bart. Moored in the harbor, the Jean Bart's single operational turret of 4 15-inch guns was a lethal threat to the entire invasion fleet. The Massachusetts' 16-inch shells slammed into the Jean Bart, disabling its turret. But the fight was far from over. Under a dense smokescreen, a flotilla of French destroyers bravely sortied from the harbor, racing to attack the exposed American transports. What followed was a desperate melee. American cruisers and destroyers engaged the French ships at close range, while planes from the carrier USS Ranger swooped in to strafe and bomb. Watching from the bridge of his flagship, General Patton, who had his gear blown overboard by the concussion of the guns, was said to have thoroughly enjoyed the spectacle. By the end of the day, the Vichy fleet was shattered. The U.S. Army and Navy had survived their baptism by fire. The price of their education was paid on the beaches and in the waters off Morocco. The painful lessons learned here about logistics, training, and coordination would form the foundation for every subsequent Allied invasion, from Sicily to the shores of Normandy. Algiers, November 10, 1942. The fighting rages on. A fateful encounter is about to change the course of the campaign. While American forces were locked in battle in Morocco, a bizarre twist of fate was unfolding in Algiers. By sheer coincidence, Admiral François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of all Vichy French armed forces, Marshal Pétain's designated successor, and a notorious Nazi collaborator, was in the city visiting his son, who had been stricken with polio. The one man in North Africa with the undisputed authority to order a ceasefire had fallen directly into Allied hands. From his headquarters in Gibraltar, General Eisenhower faced a terrible choice. He could continue a bloody and costly fight against the French, a battle that was delaying his advance and allowing the Germans to pour reinforcements into Tunisia. Or he could make a deal with a man who had actively collaborated with Hitler. Intense negotiations led by Major General Mark Clark, the Americans laid out their terms. Eisenhower chose pragmatism over principle. To save the lives of his men and secure his military objectives, he authorized the deal. In exchange for ordering all French forces in North Africa to cease resistance and join the Allies, Darlan would be recognized as the political head of the French administration in the region. On November 11th, the armistice was signed. The fighting stopped. This was the first great test of America's wartime idealism against the grim realities of the battlefield. The war had been presented to the American people as a clear moral crusade of democracy versus fascism. The Darlan deal instantly muddied those waters, forcing a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that military victory sometimes requires morally ambiguous choices. The reaction back home was a firestorm of outrage. The press in both Britain and America was furious. On his influential CBS radio broadcast, Edward R. Murrow captured the public's disbelief, asking his millions of listeners, "Were we fighting the fascists, or were we sleeping with them?" The deal, defended by Roosevelt and Churchill as a temporary military expedient, seemed to betray the very cause for which they were fighting. The controversy was abruptly cut short on Christmas Eve, 1942, when a young French royalist assassinated Darlan in Algiers. But the political damage had been done. To repair the Allied moral standing and quell the public outcry, President Roosevelt needed to make a powerful, unequivocal statement. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, he did just that. He announced that the Allies would accept nothing less from the Axis powers than unconditional surrender. This famous doctrine, which would shape the remainder of the war, was not born from a purely military calculation. It was a political necessity, forged in the public relations crisis of the Darlan deal. A short-term, pragmatic solution to a battlefield problem had paradoxically given rise to a long-term, inflexible policy that would eliminate any possibility of a negotiated peace. Tunisia, May 1943. 6 months after the landings, the North African campaign is over. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa were crushed, trapped between Eisenhower's armies advancing from the west and the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery driving from the east. Nearly 300,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. Operation Torch had achieved its strategic goals. It secured the vital ports of North Africa, opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and brought the French African army back into the war. As Winston Churchill famously declared, it was not the beginning of the end, but it was, perhaps, the end of the beginning. But the true legacy of Operation Torch was not measured in territory captured, but in experience gained. It was the crucial, bloody training ground that transformed a green, peacetime American army into a seasoned fighting force. The brutal lessons of the chaotic landings, the flawed coordination, and the logistical nightmares were studied, analyzed, and corrected. These painful experiences led directly to the development of new doctrines, new technologies like the LST landing ship, and new levels of inter-service cooperation that would prove indispensable in the later invasions of Sicily and, most critically, Normandy. The campaign also forged the commanders who would lead the Allies to victory. Dwight Eisenhower emerged from the crucible of Torch having proven he could command a vast, complex coalition and navigate treacherous political waters. It was in North Africa that he earned the trust that would lead to his appointment as Supreme Commander for the invasion of France. In the end, Operation Torch vindicated President Roosevelt's controversial decision. General Marshall had been right that it would delay the cross-channel invasion. But the campaign proved that the American Army of 1942 was simply not ready for that fight. An invasion of France in 1942 or 1943 would almost certainly have been a catastrophe. The gamble in North Africa, for all its flaws and compromises, was not a diversion from the decisive battle for Europe. It was the painful, bloody, but absolutely necessary prerequisite for it. Torch also marked a profound and lasting shift in global power. It was the first time the United States projected its military and political might on a massive scale into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. By leading the invasion and negotiating directly with local powers, America began to supplant Britain as the dominant Western influence in the region. This was the birth of America's modern strategic role in a part of the world where its presence would shape the course of history for the rest of the 20th century and beyond.